The New Testament is the second major part of the Christian biblical canon, the first part being the Old Testament, based on the Hebrew Bible. The New Testament discusses the teachings and person of Jesus, as well as events in first-century Christianity. Christians regard both the Old and New Testaments together as sacred scripture. The New Testament has frequently accompanied the spread of Christianity around the world. It reflects and serves as a source for Christian theology and morality. Both extended readings and phrases directly from the New Testament are also incorporated into the various Christian liturgies. The New Testament has influenced religious, philosophical, and political movements in Christendom and left an indelible mark on literature, art, and music. The New Testament is an anthology, a collection of Christian works written in the common Greek language of the first century, at different times by various writers who were early Jewish disciples of Jesus, and the modern consensus is that it also provides important evidence regarding Judaism in the 1st century CE. In almost all Christian traditions today, the New Testament consists of 27 books. The original texts were written in the 1st and perhaps the 2nd centuries of the Christian era, in Greek, which was the common language of the Eastern Mediterranean from the conquests of Alexander the Great until the evolution of Byzantine Greeks. All the works that eventually became incorporated into the New Testament are believed to have been written no later than around 150 AD, and a small minority of scholars would date them to no later than 70 AD. John A. T. Robinson, Dan Wallace, and William F. Albright dated all the books of the New Testament before 70 AD. Others give a final date of 80 AD, or 96 AD. Collections of related texts such as letters of the Apostle Paul and the canonical Gospels of Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John gradually were joined to other collections and single works in different combinations to form various Christian canons of Scripture. Over time, some disputed books, such as the Book of Revelation and the minor Catholic epistles, were introduced into canons in which they were originally absent. Other works earlier held to be scripture, such as 1 Clement, the Shepherd of Hermas, and the Dies Irae, were excluded from the New Testament. The Old Testament canon is not completely uniform among all major Christian groups, including Roman Catholics, Protestants, the Greek Orthodox Church, the Slavic Orthodox Churches, and the Armenian Orthodox Church. However, the 27-book canon of the New Testament, at least since late antiquity, has been almost universally recognized within Christianity. The New Testament consists of 4 narratives of the life, teaching, death and resurrection of Jesus, called Gospels, a narrative of the Apostles' ministries in the early Church called the Acts of the Apostles, and probably written by the same writer as the Gospel of Luke, which it continues. 21 letters, often called epistles from Greek epistole, written by various authors, and consisting of Christian doctrine, counsel, instruction and conflict resolution, and an apocalypse, the Book of Revelation, which is a book of prophecy, containing some instructions to 7 local congregations of Asia Minor, but mostly containing prophetical symbology about the end times. Etymology. The term New Testament or New Covenant first occurs in Jeremiah chapter 31 verse 31. The same Greek phrase for New Covenant is found elsewhere in the New Testament. In early Bible translations into Latin, the phrase was rendered foedus, federation, in Jeremiah chapter 31 verse 31, and was rendered testamentum in Hebrews chapter 8 verse 8 and other instances sources from which comes the English term New Testament. Modern English, like Latin, distinguishes Testament and Covenant as alternative translations, and consequently the treatment of the term delta iota alpha theta eta kappa eta diath k varies in English translations of the Bible. John Wycliffe's 1395 version is a translation of the Latin Vulgate and so follows different terms in Jeremiah and Hebrews. Lo, days shall come, saith the Lord, and I shall make a new covenant with the house of Israel, and with the house of Judah. He reproving him saith, Lo, days come, saith the Lord, when I shall establish a new testament on the house of Israel, and on the house of Judah. Use of the term New Testament to describe a collection of 1st and 2nd century Christian Greek scriptures can be traced back to Tertullian. In Against Marcion, written circa 208 AD, he writes of the divine word, who is doubly edged with the two testaments of the law and the gospel. And Tertullian continues later in the book, writing, It is certain that the whole aim at which he has strenuously labored, even in the drawing up of his antitheses, centers in this, that he may establish a diversity between the Old and the New Testaments, so that his own Christ may be separate from the Creator, as belonging to this rival God, and as alien from the law and the prophets. By the 4th century, the existence, even if not the exact contents, of both an Old and New Testament had been established. Lactantius, a 3rd-4th century Christian author, wrote in his early 4th century Latin Institutions Divinae, but all Scripture is divided into two testaments, that which preceded the advent and passion of Christ, that is, the law and the prophets, is called the Old, but those things which were written after his resurrection are named the New Testament. The Jews make use of the Old, we of the New, but yet they are not discordant, for the New is the fulfilling of the Old, and in both there is the same testator, even Christ, who, having suffered death for us, made us heirs of his everlasting kingdom, the people of the Jews being deprived and disinherited, as the prophet Jeremiah testifies when he speaks such things. Behold, the days come, saith the Lord, that I will make a new testament to the house of Israel and the house of Judah, not according to the testament which I made to the fathers, in the day that I took them by the hand to bring them out of the land of Egypt, for they continued not in my testament, and I disregarded them, saith the Lord. For that which he said above, that he would make a new testament to the house of Judah, shows that the Old Testament which was given by Moses was not perfect, but that which was to be given by Christ would be complete. Books. The canon of the New Testament is the collection of books that most Christians regard as divinely inspired and constituting the New Testament of the Christian biblical canon. In the period extending roughly from 50 to 150 AD, a number of documents began to circulate among the churches, including epistles, gospel accounts, memoirs, prophecies, homilies, and collections of teachings. While some of these documents were apostolic in origin, others drew upon the tradition the apostles and ministers of the Word had utilized in their individual missions, and still others represented a summation of the teaching entrusted to a particular church center. Several of these writings sought to extend, interpret, and apply apostolic teaching to meet the needs of Christians in a given locality. In general, among Christian denominations, the New Testament canon came to be agreed upon as a list of 27 books. Although the order of the books can vary from one version of the printed scriptures to the next, the book order is the same in the Greek Orthodox, Roman Catholic, and Protestant traditions. The Slavonic, Armenian, and Ethiopian traditions have different New Testament book orders. The Gospels. Each of the four Gospels in the New Testament narrates the life, death, and resurrection of Jesus of Nazareth. The word gospel derives from the Old English godspell, meaning good news or glad tidings. The gospel was considered the good news of the coming kingdom of Messiah and the redemption through the life and death of Jesus. The central Christian message. Gospel is a calque of the Greek word epsilon alpha gamma gamma epsilon lambda iota omicron nu euangelion. Since the 2nd century, the 4 narrative accounts of the life and work of Jesus Christ have been referred to as the Gospel of, or the Gospel according to, followed by the name of the supposed author. Whatever these admittedly early ascriptions may imply about the sources behind of the perception of these Gospels, they are anonymous compositions. The Gospel of Matthew, ascribed to the Apostle Matthew. This Gospel begins with a genealogy of Jesus and a story of his birth that includes a visit from Magi and a flight into Egypt, and it ends with the commissioning of the disciples by the resurrected Jesus. The Gospel of Mark, ascribed to Mark the Evangelist. This Gospel begins with the preaching of John the Baptist and the baptism of Jesus. 2 different secondary endings were affixed to this Gospel in the 2nd century. The Gospel of Luke, ascribed to Luke the Evangelist, who was not one of the 12 apostles, but was mentioned as a companion of the Apostle Paul and as a physician. This Gospel begins with parallel stories of the birth and childhood of John the Baptist and Jesus and ends with appearances of the resurrected Jesus, and his ascension into heaven. The Gospel of John, ascribed to John the Apostle. This Gospel begins with a philosophical prologue and ends with appearances of the resurrected Jesus. It is about Jesus's miracles. The first 3 Gospels listed above are classified as the Synoptic Gospels. They contain similar accounts of the events in Jesus' life and his teaching, due to the literary interdependence. The Gospel of John is structured differently and includes stories of several miracles of Jesus and sayings not found in the other 3. These 4 Gospels that were eventually included in the New Testament were only a few among many other early Christian Gospels. The existence of such texts is even mentioned at the beginning of the Gospel of Luke. Other early Christian Gospels, such as the so-called Jewish Christian Gospels or the Gospel of Thomas, also offer both a window into the context of early Christianity and may provide some assistance in the reconstruction of the historical Jesus. Acts of the Apostles. The Acts of the Apostles is a narrative of the Apostles' ministry and activity after Christ's death and resurrection, from which point it resumes and functions as a sequel to the Gospel of Luke. Examining style, phraseology, and other evidence, modern scholarship generally concludes that Acts and the Gospel of Luke share the same author, referred to as Luke Acts. Luke Acts does not name its author. Church tradition identified him as Luke the Evangelist, the companion of Paul, but the majority of scholars reject this due to the many contradictions between Acts and the authentic Pauline letters. The most probable date of composition is around 801 AD, and there is evidence that it was still being substantially revised well into the 2nd century. Epistles. The epistles of the New Testament are considered by Christians to be divinely inspired and holy letters, written by the apostles and disciples of Christ, to either local congregations with specific needs, or to New Covenant Christians in general, scattered about, or general epistles. General epistles. The general epistles consist of both letters and treatises in the form of letters written to the church at large. The term Catholic, used to describe these letters in the oldest manuscripts containing them, here simply means general or universal. The authorship of a number of these is disputed. Epistle of James, written by an author named James, are often identified with James, the brother of Jesus. First Epistle of Peter, ascribed to the Apostle Peter. Second Epistle of Peter, ascribed to the Apostle Peter, though widely considered not to have been written by him. First Epistle of John, ascribed to John the Apostle. Second Epistle of John, ascribed to John the Apostle. Third Epistle of John, ascribed to John the Apostle. Epistle of Jude, written under the name of Jude, the brother of Jesus and James. Pauline epistles. The Pauline epistles are the 13 New Testament books that present Paul the Apostle as their author. 6 of the letters are disputed. 4 are thought by most modern scholars to be pseudepigraphic, i.e., not actually written by Paul even if attributed to him within the letters themselves. Opinion is more divided on the other 2 disputed letters. These letters were written to Christian communities in specific cities or geographical regions, often to address issues faced by the particular community. Prominent themes include the relationship both to broader pagan society, to Judaism, and to other Christians. Epistle to the Romans. First Epistle to the Corinthians. Second Epistle to the Corinthians. Epistle to the Galatians. Epistle to the Ephesians*. Epistle to the Philippians. Epistle to the Colossians*. First Epistle to the Thessalonians. Second Epistle to the Thessalonians*. Hebrews. The Epistle to the Hebrews addresses a Jewish audience who had come to believe that Jesus was the Anointed One who was predicted in the writings of the Hebrew Bible. The author discusses the betterness of the New Covenant and the ministry of Jesus over the Mosaic Covenant and urges the readers in the practical implications of this conviction through the end of the epistle. The book has been widely accepted by the Christian Church as inspired by God and thus authoritative, despite the acknowledgement of uncertainties about who its human author was. Regarding authorship, although the Epistle to the Hebrews does not internally claim to have been written by the Apostle Paul, some similarities in wordings to some of the Pauline epistles have been noted and inferred. In antiquity, some began to ascribe it to Paul in an attempt to provide the anonymous work an explicit apostolic pedigree. In the 4th century, Jerome and Augustine of Hippo supported Paul's authorship. The Church largely agreed to include Hebrews as the 14th letter of Paul, and affirmed this authorship until the Reformation. The letter to the Hebrews had difficulty in being accepted as part of the Christian canon because of its anonymity. As early as the 3rd century, Origen wrote of the letter, "Men of old have handed it down as Paul's, but who wrote the epistle God only knows." Contemporary scholars often reject Pauline authorship for the Epistle to the Hebrews, based on its distinctive style and theology, which are considered to set it apart from Paul's writings. Pastoral epistles. The pastoral epistles, presented as if written by Paul, are addressed to individuals with pastoral oversight of churches and discuss issues of Christian living, doctrine and leadership. They often address different concerns to those of the preceding epistles. All 3, excluding the epistle to Philemon, of these are believed to be pseudepigraphic. First Epistle to Timothy*. Second Epistle to Timothy*. Epistle to Titus*. Epistle to Philemon. Book of Revelation. The final book of the New Testament is the Book of Revelation, also known as the Apocalypse of John. In the New Testament canon, it is considered prophetical or apocalyptic literature. Its authorship has been attributed either to John the Apostle or to another John designated John of Patmos, after the island where the text says the revelation was received. Some ascribe the writership date as circa 8196 AD, and others at around 68 AD. The work opens with letters to 7 churches and thereafter takes the form of an apocalypse, a literary genre popular in ancient Judaism and Christianity. New Testament canons table notes the growth and development of the Armenian biblical canon is complex. Extra-canonical New Testament books appear in historical canon lists and recensions that are either distinct to this tradition, or where they do exist elsewhere, never achieved the same status. Some of the books are not listed in this table. These include the Prayer of Euthalius, the Repose of St. John the Evangelist, the Doctrine.The, a reading from the Gospel of James, the Second Apostolic Canons, the Words of Justice, Dionysius Areopagite, the Preaching of Peter, and a poem by Gazar. A possible exception here to canonical exclusivity is the Second Apostolic Canons, which share a common source, the Apostolic Constitutions, with certain parts of the Orthodox New Testament broader canon. There is some uncertainty about whether it is actually the Doctrine.The, or rather a related work called the Acts of Thaddeus, that appears in Armenian canon lists. Moreover, the correspondence between King Akbar and Jesus Christ, which is found in various forms, including within both the Doctrine.The and the Acts of Thaddeus, sometimes appears separately. The Prayer of Euthalius and the Repose of St. John the Evangelist appear in the appendix of the 1805 Armenian Zorab Bible. However, some of the aforementioned books, though they are found within canon lists, have nonetheless never been discovered to be part of any Armenian biblical manuscript. Though widely regarded as non-canonical, the Gospel of James obtained early liturgical acceptance among some Eastern churches and remains a major source for many of Christendom's traditions related to Mary, the mother of Jesus. ABCD. The Diatessaron Gospel Harmony became a standard text in some Syriac-speaking churches down to the 5th century, when it gave way to the four separate Gospels found in the Peshitta. ABCD. Parts of these four books are not found in the most reliable ancient sources, in some cases are thought to be later additions, and have therefore not appeared historically in every biblical tradition. They are as follows: Mark chapter 16 verses 9 to 20, John 7:53 to 8:11, the Comma Johanneum, and portions of the Western version of Acts. To varying degrees, arguments for the authenticity of these passages, especially for the one from the Gospel of John, have occasionally been made. Scaranes, a commentary on the Gospel of John in the Gothic language, was included in the Wulfila Bible. It exists today only in fragments. AB. The Acts of Paul and Thecla, the Epistle of the Corinthians to Paul, and the Third Epistle to the Corinthians are all portions of the Greater Acts of Paul narrative, which is part of a stichometric catalogue of New Testament canon found in the Codex Claromontanus, but has survived only in fragments. Some of the content within these individual sections may have developed separately. ABCD. These four works were questioned or spoken against by Martin Luther, and he changed the order of his New Testament to reflect this. But he did not leave them out, nor has any Lutheran body since. Traditional German Luther Bibles are still printed with the New Testament in this changed Lutheran order. The vast majority of Protestants embrace these four works as fully canonical. ABCD. The Peshitta excludes 2 John, 3 John, 2 Peter, Jude, and Revelation, but certain Bibles of the modern Syriac traditions include later translations of those books. Still today, the official lectionary followed by the Syriac Orthodox Church and the Assyrian Church of the East presents lessons from only the 22 books of Peshitta. The version to which appeal is made for the settlement of doctrinal questions. The Third Epistle to the Corinthians often appears with and is framed as a response to the Epistle of the Corinthians to Paul. The Epistle to the Laodiceans is present in some Western non-Roman Catholic translations and traditions. Especially of note is John Wycliffe's inclusion of the epistle in his English translation, and the Quakers' use of it to the point where they produced a translation and made pleas for its canonicity. See Paul's annotations on Col. 4:16. The epistle is nonetheless widely rejected by the vast majority of Protestants. The Apocalypse of Peter, though not listed in this table, is mentioned in the Muratorian fragment and is part of a stichometric catalogue of New Testament canon found in the Codex Claromontanus. It was also held in high regard by Clement of Alexandria. Other known writings of the Apostolic Fathers not listed in this table are as follows: the 7 epistles of Ignatius, the Epistle of Polycarp, the Martyrdom of Polycarp, the Epistle to Dionysius, the fragment of Quadratus of Athens, the fragments of Papias of Hierapolis, the relics of the elders preserved in Irenaeus, and the Apostles' Creed. Though they are not listed in this table, the apostolic constitutions were considered canonical by some, including Alexius Aristenus, John of Salisbury, and to a lesser extent, Grigotat. They are even classified as part of the New Testament canon within the body of the constitutions itself. Moreover, they are the source for a great deal of the content in the Orthodox Tetrahedro broader canon. ABCDE. These 5 writings attributed to the Apostolic Fathers are not currently considered canonical in any biblical tradition, though they are more highly regarded by some more than others. Nonetheless, their early authorship and inclusion in ancient biblical codices, as well as their acceptance to varying degrees by various early authorities, requires them to be treated as foundational literature for Christianity as a whole. AB Ethiopic Clement and the Ethiopic Didaskalia are distinct from and should not be confused with other ecclesiastical documents known in the West by similar names. Book order. The order in which the books of the New Testament appear differs between some collections and ecclesiastical traditions. In the Latin West, prior to the Vulgate, the 4 Gospels were arranged in the following order: Matthew, John, Luke, and Mark. The Syriac Peshitta places the major general epistles immediately after Acts and before the Pauline epistles. The order of an early edition of the letters of Paul is based on the size of the letters, longest to shortest, though keeping 1 and 2 Corinthians and 1 and 2 Thessalonians together. The pastoral epistles were apparently not part of the Corpus Paulinum in which this order originated and were later inserted after 2 Thessalonians, and before Philemon. Hebrews was variously incorporated into the Corpus Paulinum either after 2 Thessalonians, after Philemon, or after Romans. The New Testament of the 16th century Luther Bible continues to this day to place Hebrews, James, Jude, and the Apocalypse last. This reflects the thoughts of the reformer Martin Luther on the canonicity of these books. Apocrypha. The books that eventually found a permanent place in the New Testament were not the only works of Christian literature produced in the earliest Christian centuries. The long process of canonization began early, sometimes with tacit reception of traditional texts, sometimes with explicit selection or rejection of particular texts as either acceptable or unacceptable for use in a given context. Over the course of history, those works of early Christian literature that survived but that did not become part of the New Testament have been variously grouped by theologians and scholars, drawing upon, though redefining, an older term used in early Christianity and among Protestants when referring to those books found in the Christian Old Testament although not in the Jewish Bible. Modern scholars began to refer to these works of early Christian literature not included in the New Testament as apocryphal, by which was meant non-canonical. Collected editions of these works were then referred to as the New Testament Apocrypha, typically excluded from such published collections of the following groups of works: the Apostolic Fathers, the 2nd century Christian apologists, the Alexandrians, Tertullian, Methodius of Olympus, Novatian, Cyprian, Martyrdoms, and the Desert Fathers. Almost all other Christian literature from the period, and sometimes including works compared composed well into late antiquity, are relegated to the so-called New Testament Apocrypha. Although not considered to be inspired by God, these apocryphal works may be helpful in the study of the New Testament in that they were produced in the same ancient context and often using the same language as those books that would eventually form the New Testament. Some of these later works are dependent upon books that would later come to be in the New Testament or upon the ideas expressed in them. There is even an example of a pseudepigraphical letter composed under the guise of a presumably lost letter of the Apostle Paul, the Epistle to the Laodiceans.